It was a chilly Tuesday morning when Claire Monroe walked into Memorial Bay Hospital, her heart heavy with dread. She had just received an urgent call from her husband, James Monroe's office, informing her that he was admitted for an unexpected medical emergency. Claire had never expected something like this to happen. Her husband, the reliable and ever-strong James, had always been in great health. She thought of the years they'd spent together, 16 years of marriage filled with trust and affection. As she entered the hospital, Claire's mind raced. James had never called her in such a frantic tone before. The few details she'd been given were sketchy, and nothing seemed to make sense. He was in his early 40s, fit and healthy, but when the nurse met her at the entrance of his hospital room, she saw the concern in the nurse's eyes that made her feel a cold shiver down her spine. "Mrs. Monroe, please follow me," the nurse said gently, leading Claire down a sterile corridor. The walls were lined with medical charts, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Every step seemed to take longer than the last as Claire's heartbeat thudded louder in her ears. Finally, they arrived at the room. The door was cracked open, and Claire could see her husband lying in a hospital bed, his face pale, his eyes closed. There was a thin, white bandage around his left wrist, which was hooked up to an IV drip. "James," Claire whispered, stepping into the room. She felt her chest tighten as she approached the bed. At the sound of her voice, James's eyes fluttered open. His usual calm, confident expression was gone. His face was strained as if he was struggling to hold on to something. Something important. Something he hadn't told her. "Claire," he rasped, his voice weak, "I didn't want you to find out this way." "Find out what?" Claire's voice wavered with confusion and fear. She stood beside the bed, gripping the edge of it. "What happened? Why are you here?" James's lips twitched, as though trying to smile, but the effort drained him of all energy. He turned his head toward her and whispered, "I'm sorry. There's so much I've kept from you, about everything. But it's too late now. Please, just trust me." Before Claire could ask what he meant, the door to the room swung open, and a man she didn't recognize stepped inside. He was tall, with graying hair and sharp eyes. He wore a dark suit, looking far more formal than anyone else in the room. "Mrs. Monroe?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. "I'm Detective Samuel Hayes. I'm investigating your husband's condition." Claire blinked, taken aback. "Investigating? What do you mean?" "My husband is in the hospital because of some emergency, not a crime." Detective Hayes didn't flinch at her response. He walked over to the bed where James lay, and Claire's pulse quickened. What was going on? Why was a detective here? Her heart started racing with confusion and mounting fear. "I know this is a difficult time, Mrs. Monroe, but we need to ask you some questions," Hayes continued, his voice calm, but there was an underlying firmness that made Claire uneasy. James groaned softly, as if the mention of an investigation pained him more than the injury he had sustained. I didn't want her to know this way," James muttered. "Claire, I've been hiding things. Things I should have told you." Claire's mind was spinning. She could feel the blood rushing to her ears as she tried to process the words. "What things? What are you talking about?" The detective stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm afraid your husband has been involved in something much more serious than a simple medical emergency. I think you need to hear what's been happening. You might not like what you're about to hear." Claire felt the room spin as she tried to stay focused. What does this have to do with him being in the hospital? What happened to him? Detective Hayes turned his gaze to James, whose face had grown even paler. There was something dark behind his eyes, a secret that Claire had never known about, something her husband had hidden for years. James Monroe was involved in a series of actions that are now part of a criminal investigation. This hospital visit is only the tip of the iceberg. Claire felt a wave of nausea hit her. She stepped back, her mind unable to process the words. This couldn't be happening. Her husband, the man she had loved for so long, the father of their children, could never be involved in something criminal. It was impossible, but the look in James's eyes told her otherwise. "I'm sorry, Claire," James whispered again, his voice barely audible now. "You deserve the truth, but it's too late now." Before Claire could respond, the detective continued. We're going to need your full cooperation, Mrs. Monroe. There are things that have been going on for a long time, and we need to uncover the truth. It's only a matter of time before you know everything." As the detective spoke, Claire's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. What could James have been hiding from her? What was so serious that a detective was involved? And what had caused him to end up in this hospital bed, looking as though he was on the verge of collapse? With her mind racing, Claire reached out for her husband's hand. But there was no comfort in his touch, only a sense of betrayal, a deep well of secrets that she had never known about. The words, "I'm sorry," echoed in her mind, but they did little to ease the overwhelming sense of dread that settled in her chest. As Claire tried to hold back her tears, the detective spoke again, his voice more serious than ever. "We'll need to speak more, Mrs. Monroe. There's much to discuss, and your husband's secrets are far darker than you realize. But for now, we need to focus on what happened to him and how this all connects." With that, Claire's world began to unravel. Claire sat at the edge of James's hospital bed, staring at him with a sense of disbelief. The words the detective had spoken still echoed in her mind, each one louder than the last. Criminal investigation? Secrets? She couldn't understand how it had all come to this. James was still unconscious, hooked up to the machines that beeped quietly in the background, monitoring his vital signs. He looked frail, vulnerable, and so unlike the strong, self-assured man she had known for over a decade. A knot formed in Claire's stomach as she gazed at him, her heart torn between the man she had loved for so long and the stranger who now lay in front of her. The hospital room felt cold, and Claire could barely focus on the sterile environment around her. She had been pacing for the last hour, trying to sort through the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that had crashed over her since Detective Hayes had arrived. Claire took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. She had to understand what was happening. She had to know what her husband had gotten involved in. As much as she wanted to scream at him to wake up and tell her the truth, she knew he was in no condition to explain himself now. All she had were the fragmented words from the detective and her growing sense of dread. The door to the hospital room creaked open, and Claire turned to see Detective Hayes stepping in once more. He looked just as stern and composed as before, though his expression held a certain weight that made Claire feel even more unsettled. "Mrs. Monroe," the detective said, his voice smooth but edged with a quiet urgency. "I understand this is difficult, but we need to continue with the investigation. Your husband's condition is critical, but we've discovered some things that might give us a clearer picture of what's going on." Claire's heart pounded. She nodded, though her voice was shaky. "What do you mean? What have you found?" The detective stepped further into the room and took a seat in the chair across from her. His eyes never left her face, scrutinizing her reaction as though trying to gauge if she would crack under the pressure. "It's not easy, I'll admit," Hayes began, "but your husband James has been involved in illegal activities for a significant period of time. We believe he's been operating under the radar, hiding his involvement with a dangerous group." Claire's pulse quickened and her hands trembled. "A dangerous group? What kind of group?" Her voice wavered with disbelief. The detective shifted in his seat, taking a slow breath before continuing. "James Monroe is not who you think he is. He's been involved in a series of white-collar crimes, money laundering, embezzlement, fraud, along with a few other individuals. We believe he's been siphoning funds from several businesses and banks, funneling them into offshore accounts. It's been going on for years, and up until now, we haven't been able to get close to him." Claire's mind reeled. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be true. James, her husband, the father of their two children, the man who had always claimed to be dedicated to providing for his family, was involved in such crimes? The pieces of the life she thought she knew were falling apart. "But how could you know this?" she stammered, her voice breaking. "James would never do something like that. He's a good man. He works hard, takes care of us. He wouldn't—" "Mrs. Monroe," Hayes interrupted, his tone gentle but firm, "I understand this is hard to accept, but we've uncovered documents, financial transactions, and testimonies from people who were directly involved with him. He's been part of a larger operation, one that's tied to several high-level individuals. Who, who are these people? Claire asked, feeling like the ground beneath her was crumbling. Who is he working with? The detective hesitated as if weighing how much to reveal. There's a network of criminals involved. Some of them are in high positions, business owners, politicians, and even law enforcement officers. Your husband was just one of many. We've been watching him for months, trying to piece everything together. Claire stared at the detective, her breath catching in her throat. This was unreal. It felt like she had been thrown into a nightmare. She had no idea her husband had been living this double life. How could I not have known, she wondered, guilt starting to claw at her insides. But what happened? Why is he in the hospital now? She managed to ask. Why is he lying there like this, fighting for his life? Hayes's expression hardened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Something that looked like anger, or perhaps regret. We're still trying to piece together exactly what led to his condition, but from what we've gathered so far, it seems that he was attacked by someone within his own circle. It's likely a message, a warning. Claire recoiled, her eyes wide with terror. A warning? Who would do that? We believe it was someone he trusted, someone he was working with in this operation. They might have thought he was trying to back out, or perhaps he got too close to exposing them. It's still unclear, but the injury to his wrist, the wound that led to his hospitalization, was not self-inflicted. Someone wanted him to suffer. Claire's head was spinning. She could feel her pulse in her throat. So he's been lying to me for all these years? All this time he's been hiding this from me? Our family? How could he do this? How could he? I understand how you feel, Mrs. Monroe, Hayes said quietly, his voice softening a little. This is a betrayal of the highest degree. But I need you to stay calm. There's still more to uncover. Claire was shaking now, a deep, aching pain in her chest. She had trusted James, believed in him. He had been her partner in every sense of the word. How could I have been so blind? She thought back over their years together. She remembered their home, their children, the quiet weekends they spent together, the dreams they had shared. But now all of that felt like a lie. Do you think he'll survive? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective's face softened for a moment. We're doing everything we can to save him, but he's in critical condition. The next 48 hours are crucial. Is he going to tell me the truth? She asked, almost pleading. Will he finally admit everything? Is there more he hasn't told me? Hayes didn't respond immediately. He studied her with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. Whether he tells you or not, Mrs. Monroe, we're going to find the truth. But the question now is whether you're ready to hear it. Claire didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if she was ready for any of it. But as she looked at her husband lying in that bed, unconscious and vulnerable, one thing became painfully clear. Her life was about to change forever. The next morning, Claire stood at the window of James's hospital room, staring out at the bleak sky. The sterile white walls and the constant beeping of medical monitors felt like a world away from the life she once knew. The detective, Hayes, had left an hour ago, but the heaviness of his words still hung in the air, suffocating her every thought. James was still unconscious, his face pale and gaunt, as though all life had been drained from him in a single unrelenting moment. It was hard to reconcile this man with the vibrant, strong, and confident man she had shared a life with. The love of her life, her best friend, her partner in every sense. And yet she now saw him for what he truly was, a man wrapped in lies, secrets, and, as Detective Hayes had hinted, a dangerous underworld that she knew nothing about. Claire swallowed hard and turned away from the window. She didn't know what she was supposed to do anymore. She had so many questions, so many, but no answers. Hayes had promised more information would come, but that didn't help her now. What could she do while James was lying in that bed, vulnerable, with no certainty of recovery? The pain of betrayal gnawed at her insides, and she hated herself for feeling this way, for feeling betrayed by the man she thought she knew. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. Claire pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her best friend Lila. "How's James? I'm so sorry. I'm here for you if you need anything." Claire took a deep breath and tapped out a reply. "He's still in critical condition. I don't know what to do, Lila. I don't even recognize him anymore." She stared at the message for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could reach out to Lila for comfort, but no one could understand what she was going through, not even Lila. Not the way Claire needed them to, not the way Claire felt. She was trapped in a nightmare, and the person who should have been beside her through it all was the one who had created it. The sound of the door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. She turned around quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't Hayes this time. A nurse stepped inside carrying a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe," the nurse said with a kind smile. "How's your husband today?" "Still the same," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's happening. He's been hiding so much from me." The nurse, a woman in her 30s with dark brown hair and soft eyes, placed the tray on the table beside James's bed. "I know this is difficult, but you're doing everything you can. Sometimes these things take time. Just stay strong for him." Claire nodded but couldn't bring herself to answer. Instead, she stepped closer to James's bed, gazing down at his face. How could she ever trust him again? The nurse paused for a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Monroe, I know you're under a lot of stress right now, but there's something you should know." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She looked at the nurse, who lowered her voice and glanced around the room to make sure no one else was listening. "I wasn't supposed to say anything, but it seems like you're already aware that your husband has been involved in some less than legal activities." Claire froze. She hadn't expected the nurse to bring this up, but she also realized that she'd been so lost in the whirlwind of confusion and betrayal that she hadn't stopped to ask for the full picture. She needed all the pieces. She needed to understand everything. "What do you know?" Claire asked, her voice barely a murmur. The nurse took a step closer, her expression serious. "James hasn't been open about his involvement in well, let's just say the criminal activities you've been told about. But there's more, Mrs. Monroe. Much more." Claire's pulse raced. "What do you mean?" The nurse looked around the room again, making sure no one else was within earshot. "I'm not supposed to say this, but I overheard some things when he was being treated here. He wasn't exactly being discreet. He has connections with some very dangerous people, and some of them were in this hospital recently. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a lot of bad blood between him and a few of his associates." Claire's head spun. Bad blood? Dangerous people? Who were they? Claire asked urgently. "What are they after? What does this have to do with his injuries?" The nurse hesitated. She seemed to weigh whether or not to continue speaking. Finally, she gave a small nod. "You need to be careful, Mrs. Monroe. There are people looking for your husband. They don't want him alive, but they're not finished with him yet, and I don't know if you're safe either." Claire's breath caught in her throat and her body went cold. She hadn't considered the possibility that her own life might be in danger. The idea that someone might be watching her, waiting for an opportunity to strike, was too much to bear. "Are you saying someone else did this to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The nurse nodded. "Yes, there are people involved in this case who would stop at nothing to get what they want, Mrs. Monroe. And your husband is caught in the middle of it all. He made some enemies, and now they're making sure he doesn't get away." Claire's mind raced, her chest tightening with panic. Enemies? What did this mean for her? "Why are you telling me this?" Claire asked, struggling to hold it together. The nurse's eyes softened. "Because you need to know the truth. You need to be prepared. And you need to understand that your husband's story is only part of a much bigger picture." Claire's thoughts swirled in a chaotic frenzy. She had come here to be with her husband, to stand by him through whatever emergency he was facing. But now she was caught in a dark, tangled web that she didn't know how to escape from. The walls were closing in around her. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the man she had spent years with. The nurse gave one last lingering look at James before quietly exiting the room, leaving Claire alone once more with her thoughts. With a trembling hand, Claire grabbed her phone and dialed Detective Hayes's number. Her heart raced in her chest, and her mind was set on one thing. She needed answers. She needed to know everything. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, Hayes picked up. "Detective Hayes," Claire said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "You need to tell me everything. You need to tell me what James has done and why this is happening. I can't keep living in the dark." There was a long pause on the other end, and Claire could almost hear the detective's breath as he processed her words. "I'll be there. Everything." Claire's heart pounded as she stared at her husband, still unconscious in the bed. She had no idea what she was about to hear, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The waiting felt unbearable. Claire sat beside James's bed, her fingers gripping the cold metal armrest. The room, once a place of comfort and normalcy, now felt like a prison. Every sound, the beeping of the machines, the distant voices in the hallway, the rustle of footsteps outside, seemed magnified in the silence that had overtaken her life. Her world had been torn apart in a matter of hours, and nothing made sense anymore. She had tried calling Lila again, but the conversation had only gone in circles. No one could understand the weight of what Claire was facing, and that isolation gnawed at her. She felt the distance between her and the world around her widening. Everyone else, it seemed, was going about their lives, while she was caught in the middle of a storm of lies, secrets, and betrayal. The nurse had told her about James's enemies, but Claire could scarcely believe it. How could her husband, her kind, loving husband, have been involved in something so dark? She didn't want to believe it, but the more pieces she uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The more desperate the search for answers grew, the more she realized she was in too deep to turn back now. When the door opened a few moments later, Claire looked up, her heart leaping in her chest. Detective Hayes stepped inside, his somber expression betraying little emotion. He was dressed in a dark suit, and his presence felt almost oppressive in the sterile hospital room. "Mrs. Monroe," Hayes said, his voice low and measured, "I understand you're looking for answers, and you deserve them." Claire stood up, her legs unsteady. She had so many questions, so many fears. "What's happening, detective? Why is James in this hospital bed? Why would anyone want to hurt him?" Detective Hayes took a breath and motioned toward the chair across from her. "Please, have a seat. This is going to take a while." As Claire sat down, she felt the weight of the moment. She didn't know if she was ready for what was coming, but it was the only way forward. The truth, no matter how painful, was her only hope for understanding. "I know this is hard to hear, but the situation with your husband is far worse than you realize," Hayes began, sitting across from her. His eyes were sharp, as though he was trying to gauge her reaction to every word he spoke. "James Monroe has been involved in a large-scale money laundering operation for several years now. But that's not all. He's also part of an underground network of people who engage in highly illegal activities. And this isn't just about some white-collar crime. It's much darker than that." Claire's stomach twisted. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want this to be the truth. But the detective's words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating her thoughts. "This network," Hayes continued, "is tied to a number of criminal enterprises. We've been investigating it for months, and James's name kept coming up. The people he's been dealing with are not just businessmen. They're connected to organized crime, money laundering, and even murder." Claire's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was hearing. Murder? She could barely breathe. "Are you telling me he's been involved with murderers? Criminals who kill people for money?" Hayes nodded gravely. "Yes, and we've reason to believe that James wasn't just a participant. We believe he may have been one of the key figures in organizing these operations." A sharp, cold fear cut through Claire's chest. How could he do this? How could he live this double life? And I had no idea. Hayes looked at her with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "It's a question I'm sure you've been asking yourself. The truth is, James was very good at hiding things. He was very careful, and he had people around him who were equally careful in protecting his secrets." The detective paused for a moment, his fingers tapping gently on the armrest of his chair. But there's more. It's not just the money laundering and the crimes. It's the people James has hurt along the way. Claire's heart pounded harder. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. What do you mean? Who has he hurt? We're looking into several individuals who may have been victims of this network, Hayes explained, his voice steady but filled with gravity. It appears that James was connected to a series of disappearances, people who may have crossed him or threatened the operation. The room seemed to close in on Claire, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Disappearances? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had possibly been involved in making people disappear? These people, Hayes continued, were not just random criminals. They were businessmen, fellow criminals, people James knew from his dealings. Some of them may have been attempting to blackmail him, others trying to get out of the operation. But regardless of the reason, they were silenced. The detective's words hit Claire like a blow. The images of her life with James, the family dinners, the vacations, the late nights talking about their hopes for the future, now felt like they belonged to someone else. So someone attacked him? Claire managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone in his world? Someone he knew? Yes, Hayes confirmed. It's clear that the injury James sustained, his wrist, which was broken, as well as the bruises on his body, was an attack. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong or an unfortunate incident. Someone was sending him a message, and we believe it's linked to the people he's been involved with. Claire's stomach churned. A message? Who would hurt him like that? We don't know yet, Hayes said, but we're narrowing it down. There are a few people in his circle who are likely suspects, people who would see James as expendable, people who might have thought he was getting too close to exposing them. Or maybe they simply decided it was time for him to pay for his role in all of this. Claire shook her head in disbelief. She had never thought of James as someone who could betray anyone, let alone take part in something so monstrous. And yet the evidence was undeniable. The attack wasn't just a random act of violence, Hayes continued. It's part of something much bigger, a warning, a punishment, and possibly a setup. The fact that he's in this hospital bed right now is no accident. Claire's mind swirled with confusion and fear. But what happens now? What do I do? How do I protect my family? The detective's eyes softened, a hint of empathy breaking through his professional demeanor. I'm doing everything I can to find out who did this to your husband, Mrs. Monroe. But you need to be careful. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to keep their operation running. And James, whether he likes it or not, is still connected to them. You're in danger too. The weight of his words crashed down on Claire. Her pulse quickened and a chill ran through her veins. The life she had known was gone, replaced by a reality that seemed too horrific to comprehend. And the worst part? She still didn't know how deep the lies went. James? Did he want out of this? Claire asked, her voice cracking. I believe so, Hayes said quietly. But wanting out doesn't mean you get to walk away. Claire's hands gripped the edge of her seat. She felt like she was sinking into an abyss, and the deeper she went, the darker everything became. We'll find the truth, Hayes assured her. But you need to stay safe, Mrs. Monroe, and prepare yourself. The coming days will be difficult. With that, Hayes stood up, his face hardening with determination. I'll be in touch as soon as we have more information. For now, stay vigilant. As Claire watched the detective leave, her body trembling with fear, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next would change everything. There was no going back. Claire sat in the sterile hospital room, the faint hum of the machines the only sound filling the silence. The hours seemed to drag by, each minute stretching endlessly as her mind raced with the weight of what Detective Hayes had revealed. Every new piece of information had only deepened her confusion and dread. James, her husband, had been living a life filled with lies, manipulation, and criminality. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved, was nothing like the person she was beginning to understand him to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faintest stirring of movement in the bed beside her. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as she turned quickly to James. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment she thought he might wake up. But then his body stilled again, and his labored breathing continued. She reached out and gently brushed his hand, tears welling up in her eyes as she watched him. This fragile, unconscious version of James was all that remained of the man she had married, and she was afraid she might lose him entirely, both to the criminals who had attacked him and to the truth that seemed to be unraveling around them. It had been 2 days since Hayes had visited, and despite the urgency in his words, Claire had yet to hear back from him. She was beginning to feel the weight of the unknown press down on her, suffocating her with the realization that there were no easy answers, no simple way out of the mess James had created. The door to the room opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Lila, her best friend who had been trying to reach Claire for the past few hours, finally made her way to the hospital. Claire couldn't help the tiny flicker of relief that sparked in her chest at the sight of Lila's warm, concerned face. Lila crossed the room swiftly, offering Claire a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. How is he?" Claire pulled away, wiping the tears from her eyes. "He's still unconscious, still in critical condition. The doctors say he's stable, but they don't know when or if he'll wake up. I just—" Her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to push away the dizziness threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know what to do anymore, Lila. I'm so scared. I've been trying to hold it all together, but I don't know if I can." Lila's expression softened, and she sat down beside Claire, her hand resting comfortingly on her friend's arm. "You don't have to hold it all together, Claire. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you. I'll help you through this, okay?" Claire nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude for Lila's unwavering support. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean on her friend, feeling the weight of everything she had been holding inside slowly begin to loosen. But the relief was fleeting. The truth, no matter how hard it was to accept, still loomed over her, casting a long, dark shadow over everything. "Lila," Claire began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I didn't even want to believe, but it's all true." Lila turned to her, her brows furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? What's going on, Claire?" "The detective," Claire said quietly, her hands trembling as she spoke. "He told me that James has been involved in some horrible things. Crimes, a network of criminals, money laundering, disappearances, even murder. And now someone's attacked him, and I don't know if he'll ever wake up. I don't know if I'll ever get the truth out of him." Lila's face fell, her eyes wide with disbelief. "James? The James I know? He's been involved in that kind of thing?" "I don't know who he is anymore," Claire said, her voice breaking. "The man I married, he's not who I thought he was. I can't make sense of any of it. I thought I knew him better than anyone, but he's been hiding this dark side of himself for so long, and I had no idea." Lila was silent for a long moment, her hands clenched in her lap as she processed Claire's words. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Claire, I know this is hard. I know it feels like the world is crashing down around you, but you have to remember something. You didn't know about this. You had no idea. He lied to you, yes, but that doesn't make you responsible for what he did. You didn't cause any of this." Claire wiped her eyes again, feeling the weight of Lila's words sink in. She had been blaming herself, as if somehow she should have seen the signs earlier. But Lila was right. She couldn't have known. There was no way she could have seen this coming. But it didn't make the betrayal any easier to bear. It didn't make the pain of his lies any less sharp. "I just feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare," Claire whispered. "Every time I think I've got a handle on it, something else comes up. I don't know who I can trust anymore. Not even James." Lila squeezed her friend's hand gently. "You don't have to go through this alone, Claire. You have me, and we'll figure this out together. And you still have James. Even if he's not the man you thought he was, he's still your husband. He's still the father of your children. And maybe there's still a chance for him to make things right." Claire shook her head, feeling the sharp ache in her chest. "I don't know if he can. I don't even know if he wants to make things right." Lila leaned forward, her eyes searching Claire's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "What are you saying, Claire? Are you thinking about leaving him? Giving up on him?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know who James is, and I don't know how I can go back to the life I had with him, the life we had together. Lila's eyes softened. Claire, you have to give yourself time. You can't make any decisions right now. James is still fighting for his life, and this is something you're going to need to work through, step by step. Don't make any rash choices. Just breathe and take it one day at a time. Claire nodded, grateful for Lila's comforting presence. But even as she did, she couldn't help but wonder if there was any future for her and James after everything that had happened. If he woke up, would she be able to forgive him? Would he even be the same man? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Claire looked up, startled, as Detective Hayes stepped into the room. His expression was grim, and he wasted no time in speaking. Mrs. Monroe, Hayes said, his voice low and serious, I have some news. We've identified the people behind the attack on your husband. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She felt her stomach drop, the old fear returning full force. Who were they? She asked, her voice trembling. Hayes looked at her with cold, hard eyes. It's a dangerous group, Mrs. Monroe, and they're not finished with your husband yet. You need to stay careful. This isn't over. The hospital room seemed to close in on Claire as Detective Hayes's words settled heavily in the air. She had braced herself for more bad news, but hearing that the attackers were still out there, still a threat to her husband's life, and now her own, was a chilling revelation. The sense of danger, of something lurking just beyond her reach, grew in intensity, and Claire could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Lila, sensing the shift in the room, stood up and placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. What do you mean, not finished yet? Lila asked, her voice edged with concern. Are they coming after James again? Detective Hayes, standing just inside the door, looked from Claire to Lila, his gaze sharp and calculating. It's more complicated than that, he said, his voice steady, though the tension in the room was palpable. We've identified several people involved in the attack on James, but there's a bigger picture here. This isn't just about some random attack. It's part of something much larger. James's actions, his involvement in this criminal network, have made him a target. And the people behind the attack, they're connected to a much more dangerous organization. Claire felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. What kind of organization? She asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. Her heart pounded in her chest and her hand trembled as she grasped the edge of the bed for support. The kind that's been operating under the radar for years, Hayes replied, his voice grave. Money laundering, human trafficking, and a whole host of illegal operations. James's role in all of this made him indispensable to them. He knew too much, and he had become a liability. That's why he was attacked. Claire's mind reeled. The man she had married, a man she had thought was just a regular businessman, was entangled in something so dark, so insidious, that she couldn't even begin to comprehend it. And now he was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, caught in the crossfire of a world she had never known existed. You're telling me that James has been involved in that kind of business? Claire asked, her voice shaking. How could he do this? How could he keep something like this from me for all these years? Hayes's gaze softened, though only slightly. People get involved in these kinds of things for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes they get trapped. James may have thought he could control it, but it got away from him. The people he's been dealing with aren't forgiving, and once you're in, it's hard to get out. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their operation. Claire's stomach churned. She had never thought her life would be consumed by anything so sinister. She had thought her marriage was based on trust, on love. But now it seemed that trust had been a lie, woven into the very fabric of the life she had built with James. I know this is hard to process, Hayes said, his voice softening as he looked at Claire. But you need to understand something. This is bigger than just James. His involvement with these people, the money, the power, it's not just about him anymore. There are people who want him dead, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure that happens. The room felt like it was spinning. Claire couldn't hold on to the gravity of the situation. It was as if her life had shattered into a million pieces, and now the fragments of her world were scattered beyond her reach. Her husband had been keeping secrets, secrets that had put them all in danger, and now she was caught in the middle of it all. "What are we supposed to do?" Lila asked, her voice tight with fear. "If these people are still out there, what's stopping them from coming after Claire?" Hayes's gaze darkened, and for the first time, Claire saw the full weight of his concern. "I'm working on it. We're tightening security, but you need to be careful, Mrs. Monroe. You can't trust anyone, not even the people you think you know. These people have eyes everywhere. You need to keep your guard up, and if you feel unsafe, you need to leave town. Go somewhere quiet. Lay low until we have a better understanding of who's behind this." Claire felt her pulse quicken, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The idea of leaving everything behind, of fleeing, felt like an impossible choice. But the reality of the situation was beginning to set in. The life she had known was gone. Her home, her family, even the relationships she had once taken for granted were all in jeopardy. The threat was real, and it was closing in on them. "I don't know if I can do that," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know if I can just leave and hide. I have kids, I have responsibilities, I understand," Hayes said quietly, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. "But your safety comes first. If you stay, you're putting yourself and your children at risk, and you need to make sure you're prepared for what might come next. These people won't stop until they get what they want." Lila's hand was still on Claire's shoulder, but the pressure she had once felt from it seemed to have shifted. Her friend's touch now felt like a lifeline. Claire didn't know how much longer she could keep her head above water, but as long as Lila was there, she didn't feel completely alone. "Okay," Claire said, taking a deep breath. "What do we do next?" Hayes stood up, his demeanor suddenly more resolute. "I'll keep you informed, but I need you to be ready. The people behind this aren't just going to go away. If they want James, they'll come for him, and they'll come for you too." "I'm not going anywhere," Claire replied firmly, her voice tinged with resolve. "But I need you to find them, Hayes. I need to know who these people are. I need to know who I'm up against." Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of respect in his expression. "I'll do everything I can, Mrs. Monroe, but you need to trust me, stay alert, and stay close. We're all in this together now." With that, Hayes turned and left the room, leaving Claire and Lila in the aftermath of his words. The reality of the situation was sinking in deeper than ever before. There was no turning back now. They were in a war, one that Claire hadn't asked for, but was now a part of. As Lila sat back down beside her, Claire felt a sense of determination rise within her. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she wouldn't, let the people who had destroyed her life win. She had lost so much already, but she wasn't ready to lose herself. "I'll fight this," Claire whispered to herself, her gaze hardening. "I'll fight for my family. I'll fight for James." Lila squeezed her hand once more, offering a silent promise that, no matter what, she would be there by Claire's side. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and unknowns. But for the first time in days, Claire felt something stir deep within her. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. The storm was just beginning, and she would face it head on. The days that followed Detective Hayes's ominous warning were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Claire's mind raced, her thoughts never straying too far from the danger that surrounded her. James remained in the hospital, his condition stable but still fragile. She couldn't shake the image of him lying unconscious, a victim of the dark world he had become tangled in, and as much as she wanted to believe that he could somehow make it out of this, a nagging doubt lingered. The truth was, things weren't just bad. They were beyond what she could have ever imagined. And now it was up to her to decide whether or not she would stand by him. Every night, Claire lay awake in the hospital bed next to her husband, her mind replaying everything Hayes had told her. The criminal network, the disappearances, the money laundering, and the ties to murder were all so far removed from the life she had known. It felt surreal, as though she were living in someone else's nightmare. And yet the nightmare was hers. She was the one who had built a life with a man who was now an alleged criminal. Worse still, someone had tried to kill him, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they came after her too. Hayes had promised to keep her informed, but Claire had heard nothing for days. The uncertainty gnawed at her. What if he was wrong? What if these criminals had already infiltrated the police force? What if the detective was hiding something? The paranoia clawed at her, making it difficult to trust anyone. Lila had been with her every step of the way. She had insisted Claire stay at her house for the time being, away from the dangers of their own home. But no matter where she went, Claire couldn't escape the feeling that her life was on the brink of collapse. One afternoon, a week after Hayes' last visit, the phone rang. Claire's heart skipped in her chest when she saw that it was Detective Hayes. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to hear what he had to say. But she needed answers. She needed to know if she was still in danger. "Hello?" Claire's voice was tight as she answered. "Mrs. Monroe, it's Hayes." The detective's voice was calm but full of urgency. "We need to talk. Can you meet me?" Claire's pulse quickened. "What's going on? Is James—" "He's fine." Hayes cut her off, though his tone didn't offer much reassurance. "For now, but we've made a breakthrough, and it's important that we meet in person. There are things I need to explain." Claire hesitated. She was torn between wanting to hear what Hayes had to say and the fear of what might come next. But she knew she couldn't avoid this forever. "Okay, where?" "I'll text you the address. Get there as soon as you can. And Mrs. Monroe—" Hayes's voice softened slightly. "Stay careful. I don't trust anyone right now, not even the people closest to you." Claire's stomach dropped. His warning only heightened the dread that had been building inside her for days. "I'll be there," she said, her voice shaking. The line went dead. Claire stared at the phone for a moment, processing his words. She couldn't ignore his warning. She couldn't take any chances. Whatever Hayes had discovered, it was clear that the danger was far from over. She needed to get to the bottom of it, and fast. The address Hayes had texted her led her to a quiet, unassuming part of town, tucked away behind a maze of back alleys and dilapidated buildings. The location itself sent a shiver down Claire's spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. Her eyes scanned the empty street as she parked her car, the dim streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Every instinct she had told her to turn around, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. When Claire stepped out of the car, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the shadows, was Detective Hayes. He was alone. "Mrs. Monroe," Hayes greeted her, his voice low. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy, but it's the only way to move forward. What's going on, Detective?" Claire's voice was firm, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what she was walking into, but the fear was slowly turning into something else. Something colder, more resolute. "I need answers. I need to know who did this to my husband." Hayes motioned for her to follow him as he turned and walked down the alley. "I know you do, and I promise. We're close. But there's something you need to understand first." They stopped in front of a nondescript door, a faded sign above it reading J&M Investigations. Claire's confusion only deepened. "What is this place?" Hayes gave her a knowing look before unlocking the door and stepping inside. "This is where the real work happens. You've been kept in the dark for too long. It's time you knew the truth." As Claire entered the dimly lit office, she noticed several monitors flashing with images of different people, businessmen, women, shady characters whose faces Claire didn't recognize, but whose expressions looked like they belonged to someone dangerous. "What is all this?" Claire whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "These are the people behind the operation James was involved with, the people who attacked him." Hayes's tone was unwavering as he stepped toward the nearest monitor, pointing to one of the images. "This man is Robert Lawrence. He's the leader of the group James was working for." Claire's eyes widened in shock. "Robert Lawrence? I've heard of him. He's connected to organized crime, isn't he?" "Yes," Hayes replied, his face hardening. "And he's been pulling the strings behind James's operations for years. James may have been a pawn, but he was a very important pawn. Lawrence thought he could control James, but James tried to pull away. And that's why he's in the hospital now. They were sending him a message, a warning." Claire felt her legs wobble beneath her, and she grabbed hold of a nearby chair to steady herself. "So, James wasn't just involved in some business deal gone wrong. He was in deep with these people." Hayes nodded. "Yes, And it's more complicated than you think. These people aren't just criminals. They're connected to international syndicates, and they've been covering their tracks for years. But we've been able to track their movements, and I've got enough evidence to bring them down. But we need James. He's the key. Claire's heart skipped. What do you mean? How is James the key? The key to taking down the whole operation? James knew too much. If he wakes up, he can help us. He can give us the final pieces we need. But we need to move fast. Lawrence and his people know we're on to them, and they're going to make their move soon. They won't stop until they've silenced James for good. Claire's mind spun as she processed the weight of his words. This was it. The end game. The moment of truth. The danger had never been more real. She was no longer just a wife caught in the crossfire of her husband's mistakes. She was now a part of this fight,